We are recording on Saturday, February 14th, and earlier in the week, a few things happened. First, the Republican majority in the House passed the SAVE Act, which, if it were to become law, would require proof of citizenship to vote. Second, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, urged Congress to pass the SAVE Act and then declared that even if it isn't passed, he's going to issue an executive order to make sure that there are voter ID requirements at the polls in November. This would be to prevent non-citizen voting. So in this video, we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about the SAVE Act, we're going to talk about non-citizen voting, voter fraud, and we're going to talk about voter ID. And the main message I want you to take away from this is that the SAVE Act and voter ID are totally unnecessary, that non-citizen voting is not a thing, that voter fraud, in-person voter fraud, voter impersonation, is also not a thing, and that voter ID is not actually necessary whatsoever, and that all these things, these demands for requirements for ID and citizenship test, are akin to the kind of poll taxes, literacy test, and grandfather clauses that southern states used to disenfranchise large numbers of their own citizens, black and white, during Jim Crow. Now, the SAVE Act, like I said, would require proof of citizenship to vote. You'd have to present either a birth certificate or a passport in order to register to vote or cast a ballot. The issue, obviously, is that many tens of millions of Americans do not have passports. Most Americans don't have passports, and that birth certificates are not necessarily easy to come by. I have my birth certificate around, but many Americans, especially older Americans, non-white Americans, do not have immediate access to the birth certificates. Moreover, in order to obtain a passport or a birth certificate, you have to pay money. $40, $50 for a birth certificate, $165 for a passport. And that's in addition to taking the time and everything. The effect of this would be to reduce the incidence of voting among people that I think Donald Trump and Republicans believe would favor Democrats. Part of the irony here, one of the reasons why I don't think the SAVE Act is going to pass in the Senate, why the Senate majority is not going to kill the filibuster to allow this to pass, is that if you just think about it for a second, one thing that comes across is that the pool of voters who are most likely to have passports or immediate access to birth certificates might skew Democratic, depending on the state. And the pool of voters who may not have access to that may actually skew Republican, given education polarization in the electorate. If you have a college degree, you're more likely to vote Democratic these days. If you don't, you're a little more likely to vote Republican. Education polarization, gender polarization, might actually mean that this does not play out the way that Trump and Republicans imagine. But setting aside the potential for ironic blowback in passing the SAVE Act, the problem that it's supposed to be trying to solve, non-citizen voting, is not a problem. There have been multiple studies by a variety of groups over the decades which have shown quite conclusively that non-citizen voting effectively doesn't exist. That when you look back to the past 2 or 3 decades of elections and hundreds of millions of ballots cast, you find maybe a handful of incidences of what might be non-citizen voting in federal elections. States actually can allow non-citizens to vote if they want, so can localities and municipalities. But when it comes to federal elections, there's no evidence of it. After the 2016 election, for example, multiple institutions, including my own employer, the New York Times, surveyed election and law enforcement officials in virtually every state of the union. The New York Times learned of 2 possible instances of non-citizen voting out of 137.7 million votes cast. It's not a problem. Now, Trump continues to claim again and again that there is vast and rampant non-citizen voting. He claimed it after 2016, he claimed it after 2020, and he claimed it after 2024. He also claims that there is rampant voter fraud, some kind of voter impersonation. That too is vanishingly rare if it even actually exists. The Conservative Heritage Foundation has maintained a voter fraud database for some years now in an attempt to show the frequency of voter fraud. They've had to go back decades to find instances of things that may be voter fraud. And in the states that they focused on, places like Pennsylvania and Arizona, they have, looking at decades of elections, looking at tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of ballots cast, they have found a few dozen instances of voter fraud in these states, meaning an incidence of something like 1/10,000th, 1/100,000th of a percent. It doesn't happen. You are more likely to be struck by lightning every day for like the next week than you are to encounter voter fraud in the United States. And that is because American elections are incredibly secure. States maintain any number of rules, regulations, and safeguards to ensure that there is no fraudulent voting happening. At every level of the voting apparatus in the United States, which remember is run by individual states, there are overlapping levels of safeguards designed to make sure that the identities of voters are verified. Try to register in 2 different places and get back to me. You'll find out from the state that you have broken the law, and they will come after you. States verify that ballots have not been duplicated. States verify that ballots have been accurately counted. It is one of the reasons that we don't really have recounts in the United States. Even if we have close elections, they're often superfluous because the count is exactly accurate. And there's never any evidence that there's some kind of fraudulent behavior going on. If a non-citizen were to try to register to vote for federal election, it would be caught. If they were going to try to cast a ballot to vote, it would almost certainly be caught. And to try to do this at scale is basically impossible. The claims of non-citizen voting are bunk. The claims of voter fraud are bunk. And this voter ID, a requirement for voter ID, which is popular with most Americans, is more or less unnecessary. You already have to provide proof of identity when you register to vote. And often when you go vote anyway, in most states, they ask for some proof, whether it is an ID card or a bill or something to demonstrate that you are who you say you are. But beyond that voter ID or a citizenship requirement to vote is like trying to require a volcano insurance. It is time and effort and money spent to solve a problem that doesn't exist, that isn't real. It is a burden that may end up disenfranchising people to solve a problem that isn't there, that's imaginary, that is more the product of a particular set of political ideas than it is anything in observable reality. And that's the last point I want to make. The reason why Donald Trump is obsessed with non-citizen voting and voter fraud isn't because it's real, it's because it is downstream of a belief that some Americans just don't count. That even if you are a natural-born American citizen with every right to vote that anyone else has, if you are the wrong race, the wrong gender, the wrong religion, the wrong political affiliation, Trump doesn't think you count as a full American. That is what Trump means by fraud. Not by anything illegal happening, but the wrong people voting. And so one reason to oppose these efforts to impose new requirements on voting is just to push back against this idea, to push back against the idea that voting is somehow a privilege, that you have to earn the right to vote, that there's a lack of integrity in our voting. No, there's not whatsoever. And we shouldn't honor a notion of voting that depends on the idea that some Americans are more Americans than others. Voting is a fundamental right that must be affirmed, not restricted, that must be expanded, not limited. And interestingly enough, our Constitution doesn't actually guarantee explicitly a right to vote, which is something I will discuss in a later video. For now, as I've said in previous videos, if you want to protect and defend the right to vote in the upcoming election, the best thing you can do is volunteer to work the polls, to observe the polls, and to help people register. Getting involved and participating in the democratic process is really the best way to secure the democratic process from those who seek to corrupt it.